Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on a Learning and Growing webinar on Everyone's a Writer, empowering students to unleash their inner writing genius. Our presenter today is David von Schlichten of Seton Hill University. My name is Sidra, and I'm your moderator for Hawks Learning. We will have a live Q&A session after the presentation, so please enter any questions you have into the Q&A module as we go, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. I'll now hand it over to our presenter.
Thank you, Sidra. Thank you, everybody. It is wonderful to be with you. As Sidra said, my name is David von Schlichten, and I teach at Seton Hill University, which is in southwestern Pennsylvania, about an hour east of Pittsburgh. So giving you a sense of where I am. Let me share with you my presentation. Very excited for this opportunity. Thank you to Hawks for this chance to share with you some of my thoughts about writing. I've been teaching first-year writing for 8 years now. I have a PhD in English literature and an MFA in writing, and lots of experience teaching, and it's always a learning experience. By the way, my pronouns are he, him, as you can see right there. And there's my email address, drdlphn@yahoo.com. If you ever want to reach out to me, that's absolutely fine. drdlphn, like Dr. Dolphin without the vowels. My kids call me Dolphin. That's where that comes from. Anyway, there's me, just a little bit about myself. So I'm 53 years old. I live in southwestern PA. Like I said, I've lived in Pennsylvania pretty much my whole life. And I am married. I've been married for 21 years. I have 2 children, Michael, who's 32, and Katie, who's 30. They both live with me right now. Katie has a 6-year-old daughter named Emily, pictured here, granddaughter, who I absolutely adore. She is the sun around which our solar system orbits. She just means the world to me. I've been teaching at Seton Hill for 14 years, 8 years full-time. And before that, I was a minister for 17 years. I did a career change and just love my job. I love being at Seton Hill. I think it's fantastic. Just really thrilled and lucky to be there. And I live about a mile from where I work, so I often walk to work, although I didn't today because we're dealing with Hurricane Nicole, or the remnants of Nicole today. I started a little bit more about myself. So I do a lot of writing on my own as well, both in print and online. And on September 19th, I started a Facebook page called Grow, Golden Rule Online Worldwide. And the goal of Grow is to end online hate and harassment. So we've begun this movement. We're starting to do research and create some projects to work towards ending the hatred that we see so often online that's gotten worse in the last few years. Pew Research estimates that 4 in 10 Americans experience some sort of online harassment, and that's up significantly over the last few years. So we're looking to bring those numbers down. We want to reduce online harassment by 25% by the year 2025. So very excited about that, just to give you a little bit more about myself. I teach writing, as I mentioned. I teach other things as well, gender studies and religion. I wear a lot of hats on the Hill, but I certainly teach writing. And one of the first things I tell my students is that don't try to do it all. That students, I think, sometimes get overwhelmed by writing. They think they have to be perfect. They think they have to address every single issue as a writer. They have to try to fix everything. And what I tell them is don't try to do it all. Don't let perfectionism paralyze your progress. Pictured there, by the way, is Dr. Brené Brown, who places a heavy emphasis on not striving for perfection and understanding that you are good enough. I spend a lot of time building up the confidence of my students because I think many of them are sorely lacking in it in many areas, and including in writing. You do sometimes have the student who is overconfident as a writer, but most students really doubt themselves as writers. I try to help them feel better and draw from their strengths. And I've been making use of Foundations of English by Hawks, the wonderful resources there, very helpful along those lines. I tell students, you're a better writer than you think you are. Occasionally that's not true. And we have small classes in our first year writing courses, so I can address individual needs of students. But overwhelmingly, I find that many students really underappreciate themselves as writers. They know what they do wrong, or they beat themselves up a lot as writers, but they don't pay attention to what they do right. Along those lines, many students, when they think of bad writing, they think of grammar. Well, I'm not good with commas, I'm not good with semicolons, therefore I'm a bad writer. And anybody who teaches writing knows that writing is much more than that, right? Grammar is an important part of writing. And the Foundations of English book devotes a whole chapter to grammar, which is great, chapter 4. But writing is so much more than that, right? That's why there's so much more to writing. There are issues of form and structure and genre and purpose and audience and passion and all those other things. And I try to help students see that about writing, to have a bigger, fuller picture, and to see what they do well as a writer, not just what they do wrong. And to see that writing is so much more than where you put your commas. I tell my students, I would much rather have a brilliantly argued, cogent, well-organized paper with some comma splices than a grammatically perfect paper that says nothing. So I really try to stress that to students and help them to see then what they do well as writers. I try to get students to shift from being their own worst critic to being their own best critic. And I think Foundations of English, chapters 1, 2, and 3 really do a good job of addressing some of these issues, seeing what your strengths are, what your needs are, what your focus is, and going from being your own worst critic, from beating yourself up, right? Page 45 in Foundations talks about that negative inner voice that so many of us have. It reminds me of that song Little Talks from a few years ago, the first line of the second verse. There's an old voice in my head that's holding me back, right? That's what I'm talking about here. That many of us have this negative inner voice that tells us that we're no good. That's true with life in general, and it's true when it comes to writing too. I want students, all of us, to go from being our own worst critic to being our own best critic. And I want to banish imposter syndrome, that sense of thinking that you're a phony, that you don't really belong, that you don't really have what it takes. I want people instead, myself included, I sometimes struggle with this, to see that, yes, we do belong. We do have what it takes. That doesn't mean we were perfect. It doesn't mean we don't have things to learn. It doesn't mean we can't grow, but we don't have to be perfect to be good enough. And I really stress that to students. For me, writing is intimately tied up with how people view themselves. So I teach writing along those lines. I think more generally about going from being your own worst critic to being your own best critic. So this isn't just about writing, this is more general. So if you look at these two columns here, on the left, we have the worst critic column, on the right, we have the best critic column. Do this yourself. Think, where do you fall in this? Are you somebody who thinks I should be getting more done? Or are you somebody who can celebrate what all you get done? Are you somebody who thinks that when people compliment you, they don't really mean it, or they're lying, or they're wrong? Or do you accept and just think and understand and receive graciously the compliments you receive? Do you think you're awful at your job? Or do you think I'm not perfect, but I do well at my job? Not being perfect doesn't mean I'm awful. It's not all or nothing. That's number 4. If it's not perfect, it's horrible. Perfect schmurfect. Perfect is the enemy of the good. Just because we don't write perfectly or do our jobs perfectly or be family members perfectly doesn't mean we're doing horribly. Right? That's a fallacy. That's a cognitive distortion. The book talks about fallacies, and that's one of the champions of them, and one of the most famous, infamous fallacies. I try to help students get past that in general and with writing in particular. Thinking other people are better than you instead of thinking I'm doing the best I can. It's not a competition. Thinking I do so many things wrong. That's worst critic. Best critic is, well, I'm not perfect, but I still get a lot of things right. Worst critic says, if I could do it, anyone could do it. I don't know if you ever feel that way. Well, if I could do it, it must not be hard. Instead of recognizing that a lot of us have skills that not everyone else has. We all do. I have things I do well that others don't do well. My wife, she's very organized. And so she doesn't think it's any big deal to be organized. And I say to her, Kim, actually, I call her Chi. I say, Chi, organization, not everybody's good at that. Celebrate that. Or I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just good at faking it. Instead of saying best critic, I know more than I give myself credit for knowing. So I try to help students do this shift from being their own worst critic to being their own best critic in general, and then as related to writing in particular. That's what this has to do with writing. To me, our view of ourselves in general is often reflected in our view of ourselves as writers. Not always, but oftentimes. If we're beating ourselves up in writing, we're often beating ourselves up in general and vice versa. I'm sure there are exceptions, but often there's a pretty close correlation. So I try to help students be their own best critic. And by critic, I mean celebrating your strengths, revising and editing. The Foundations of English book talks a lot about the importance of revision and editing. Identifying your purpose. Foundations of English stresses that too, as it does stress tailoring your tone to your audience, inspiring your audience, and calling to action. I want students to be their own best critic. I want them to celebrate their strengths. I want them to learn about revising and editing. Many students don't understand the importance of revision. I want them to identify purpose, tailor their tone to their audience, inspire their audience, and call to action. Let's look at each one of these. First, celebrating your strengths. We don't do this enough. You can celebrate your strengths without bragging, without being obnoxious about it. We need to know what our strengths are. Our students need to know. As young adults, as professionals, they need to be able to say, okay, this is what I am good at. And then also know what they're not good at and be open to learning and growing. That's important for all of us, but I think it's especially important for us to impart to young adults as they're getting ready to head out into the world, including as writers. What do I do well as a writer? I talk about higher order and lower order concerns. We use those terms a lot in the writing field. And so I get them to think about these items. I ask students, what among these things do you do well as a writer? We're not worried about what you do wrong yet. We're not talking about criticism yet. We'll get to what you need to work on later. But right now we're on C of critic, of being your own best critic. And the C is about what you do well. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So I might ask students, do these apply to you? My writing is easy to follow. My writing is well organized. My main point is apparent. I provide helpful detail without going overboard. I don't go on too long. I modify my tone and style according to the person or people I'm writing for. When appropriate, I clearly identify upfront what I am writing about, such as by putting something in the subject line or by providing a title. There are other higher order concerns as well. By the way, for those of you who don't know, in the writing business, higher order would be big picture items like organization, argumentation, clarity, etc., thesis. Lower order concerns are more nuts and bolts items like grammar and formatting. So I try to get students to think about these higher order concerns because those often don't occur to them. When they think writing, they think grammar. So I get them to think about these higher order concerns, and I get them to think, what of these do you do well already? Celebrate that. Don't worry about what you do wrong just yet. Right now, focus on what you do well and celebrate that. I invite you to do the same with your own writing. Go through the list. What among these things do you do well? Celebrate those things. And I try to help them see what they do well already, because many of them haven't heard that. They've heard they're not good with grammar, but they haven't heard that they're really good at these higher order things, and many students are. And I talk about lower order concerns too, right? So these are more nuts and bolts things like grammar, right? Higher order is big picture, lower order grammar and spelling and whatnot. How's your spelling? Do you make proper use of periods, question marks, and exclamation points? Do you make proper use of commas, semicolons, and colons? Do you capitalize words that should be capitalized? Do you start a new paragraph when appropriate? Do you use the proper spacing for the kind of writing that you're doing? Now, with these higher order and lower order concerns, you don't have to get these right all the time. It just has to be more often than not. More often than not, my spelling is accurate. More often than not, I use the right spacing. More often than not, my writing is easy to follow. More often than not, I don't go on too long. We're not looking for perfection here. This is the C of my own best critic. What do I do well? So I really stress that with students to get them to see what they do well already as writers. So important. Then we work on the critiquing. But what we do well first, and you don't have to do it perfectly to do it well. You don't have to do it perfectly to do it well. I'm a cheerleader. That's one of my strengths as a professor, is I'm good at cheering people on. That's me. No, not kidding. Just kidding. That's not me at all. But I could never do what that athlete is doing. But I believe in cheering people on. I think many of us go around beating ourselves up, and I try to help lift people up. Even people who act really cocky and hyper confident, really beneath the surface, they're often very insecure. So I really try to help lift people up, especially when it comes to writing. Then I stress to students the difference between revising and editing, and Foundations of English spends a good bit of time on revision and really stresses the importance of that. You can see if you look at chapters 6 and 7 of Foundations of English, you'll see a lot of emphasis on revision and editing with paragraphs and whatnot. And I differentiate between revising and editing. Revising to me is higher order. So that's big picture items. That's what you're doing there. Editing is lower order. That's correcting your grammar, proofreading, spelling, and so forth. And it's been my experience, maybe yours has been different, that most people, when they work on a paper or whatever they're working on, they tend to focus on lower items. They tend to focus on grammar, spelling, things like that. They proofread. And that's important. But we here at Seton Hill really stress the importance of revision, and Foundations of English does too, from Hawkes, stresses the importance of revising, that you work on something over and over and over. And oftentimes you discover what you think by writing it down. The act of writing helps us to know what our ideas are, and then we can go from there. So I spend a lot of time stressing to students the importance of revising as well as editing, of course. Revising is more big picture, editing more lower order. So the revising is the R of critic, all right? We're being our own best critic. C is celebrating, R is revising, which includes editing. And then I give them suggestions for things to look at. What do I need to work on? So here's a suggestions of things to think about from a higher order standpoint. And what I stress to them is don't try to tackle all of this. Don't try to fix everything. If you try to do everything, you end up doing nothing. That's true for life in general. Pick one or two of these, like during the course of a semester, pick one or two of these to concentrate on and leave the rest for another day. So you might decide, I'm going to work on being better organized. Or you might decide you're going to work on thesis statement development, or you might decide you're going to work on tightening your prose. What am I going to focus on during this period, usually a semester here at Seton Hill, in terms of improving as a writer? I'm not going to try to tackle it all. I'm going to zero in, focus on one or two things. So I'm celebrating what I do well. And in revising and editing, I'm going to pick one or two higher order concerns and one or two lower order concerns. So if you have trouble with commas, and face it, who doesn't, you might choose to focus on that, but that might mean you neglect other things, at least for now. You can tackle other things later. Right now, pick one or two things to focus on. That's what I stress to students. Don't try to do it all. Don't try to fix everything. Find things to concentrate on. I have them tell me at the beginning what they want to work on in the semester, and then I try to help them with that. Again, don't try to do it all. Revising and editing, don't do it all and dare to write bad, rough drafts. One of the great secrets of writers is that we write, and I've written extensively. I've published a couple hundred pieces. I have 5 or 6 books. I mean, so I've done a lot of writing, and I have the MFA in writing. And one of the things about being a writer, and I know many of you know this, is that writers aren't afraid to write crappy drafts and then revise them. Anne Lamott, I'll bet some of you know her famous essay where she talks about this. It comes from Bird by Bird, and she gives readers permission, or writers permission, to write poorly in that first draft. I stress that to students. I say, I'm not going to grade your grammar on this one. I'm not going to grade your content at all. You just have to turn in a rough draft, and then we'll work on it. We'll revise it. You get the points, At this stage in the assignment, they get the points just for turning in the draft. Later on, I'll correct things and take points off for errors. But in that early stage, I just say, get me a draft. I don't care how bad it is, then we'll work on it. So the R of CRITIC, revising and editing, don't try to do it all. And don't be afraid to write bad rough drafts. Students need to give themselves permission to be bad. And then as we're revising and editing, I want people to remember the ITIC of CRITIC. So CRITIC, C, celebrating what you do well. Don't skimp over that. R is revising and editing. And then I is identifying your purpose. Why am I writing this? T, tailoring your tone to your audience. I, inspiring your audience. And C, calling to action. Let's take a look at each one of those. First, identifying your purpose. Foundations of English, chapter, my picture's cut me off. Chapter 3 stresses this. Why am I writing this? What am I trying to convey? Do I have one main clear point? Most pieces have a main point. They might have secondary and tertiary points, but they have one main one. And I try to help people know what that is. I try to help people know what that is. What's that main point? Do I identify that one main clear point up front, like in the subject line of an email? This morning in class, I made up a fake email and I had the students critique it in class. And we talked about, is it clear? Is it organized? What's going on here? What's my tone? Am I light? Am I serious? Is this somebody I'm very familiar with? Is this somebody I have to be more formal with? Is this somebody who likes a little chit chat at the beginning of the email? Or is this somebody who wants you to get straight down to business? All of that matters. If I have multiple purposes, should I break them up into multiple pieces, such as more than one email or more than one letter or more than one ever, to prevent confusion and to avoid creating documents that become long and unwieldy? Nobody likes a long email that's just hundreds and hundreds of words. Tailoring your tone, the all-important tone. Am I writing for a boss or a supervisor or a professor or somebody who might give me a job? Or is this somebody I'm really close to, or is this somebody I don't know well? Many students, I find, tend to be too informal in their writing. I'm always saying to them, look, you can be chatty and informal with each other, but when you're writing to a professor or you're writing to a prospective boss, you're writing to somebody else, you got to be more buttoned down. You have to be more formal in your tone. And I think that's a real challenge for a lot of young adults, but part of my job is to help them learn those things, that proper etiquette. Is this somebody who likes a little chit chat? Some people really like that at the beginning of, say, an email, for instance. Hey, how's it going? How are you doing? How was your time at the beach? And other people want you to get straight down to business. So you need to know that. So all of those things, I tell students, don't start emails with hey, unless you're talking to somebody you're really good friends with. That's a very common mistake. Inspiring your audience. Now, we can't always inspire our readers, but more often than not, we can. And the more we can inspire people, the better. People love passion, and they love to be inspired. This gets into pathos, ethos, and logos. The book talks about this, Foundations of English. Pathos, logos is appealing to logic. Ethos is the credibility of the writer or speaker. And pathos is the appeal to the emotions. One of the great things about somebody like Martin Luther King is that he appealed to your head, but he appealed to your heart as well. He did both. And I try to encourage people, whether writing a paper, doing a PowerPoint, writing an email, whatever they're doing, as much as possible to inspire, 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 even if it's just in little ways. Like by paying somebody a sincere compliment, or expressing appreciation, if it's appropriate. Or can you share a quick story or quote, right? People love stories. Human beings are hardwired for stories. We love stories. They help us make sense of the world. Anytime you can share a story, that's effective. Can you express enthusiasm about what you're writing? Now, if you're writing like a lab report, you probably can't. But if you're writing something, but many times you can. People love enthusiasm. And you can ask yourself, how do I want my writer to feel in response to what I've written. Sometimes in education, we talk about an author's intent is about PI. PI stands for persuade, inform, or entertain. What are you trying to do as a writer? Are you trying to persuade? Are you trying just to inform, or are you trying to entertain? You might be doing all of that, but what are you emphasizing? In many of those cases, we can inspire. We can inspire, even if we're just providing information. And a call to action. What do I want my reader to do in response to my writing? You've read my essay, you've read my article, you've read my email, you've watched my PowerPoint, you've done whatever. What is it that I want the reader to do? It's important to get students to think about audience. Oftentimes when they write papers, they just sort of think generically, or they think, well, it's for the professor. And I try to get students to think, I'll bet you do too, to think, no, I want you to think about a particular audience. So like with the email we looked at this morning, it was addressed to a person, and the person was being asked to make a donation. That was the context. So what we want this person to do is make a donation, right? So what do we want this person to do? We want them to vote. We want them to take arms. We want them to do whatever, not take arms, but we want them to take action of some sort. Pictured in there, that's Sojourner Truth. So Sojourner Truth in 1851 in Ohio gave her famous Ain't I a Woman speech, in which she called for women, especially Black women, to be treated with the same rights as men, that we should allow women to have the right to vote. She called people to action. Anytime we can call people to action, it makes our writing stronger. So let me just recap that. C, celebrating our strengths, what we do well. We have to help students do that. They've heard what they do wrong. We need to help them know what they do well. Help them to revise and edit and understand the importance of revision, really looking seriously and deeply at their work and revising oftentimes multiple times. And then thinking about the I and the T and the I and the C. So being attentive to tone, to what's my objective, informing my audience, calling my audience to action, getting them to take action, all of those things, really helping them to do that. And then I also talk about grammar, of course, and Foundations of English Chapter 4 is devoted to grammar. One of the things students don't realize, I think, is that they think that grammatical rules are sort of hard and fast, unflexible, unchanging, but grammatical rules change all the time. And grammar also varies according to genre, right? So if you're writing a less formal piece, you can often be a little more relaxed about grammar. If you're writing a research paper, you often have to be more formal and more exact and precise about grammar. It really depends on the genre. That's very important. But with that in mind, I go over some basics. And I find that students often struggle with commas because commas are tricky. And so here's some basic comma rules. I talk about when you have two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, you place a comma before the conjunction. Like in the example, I hate writing, comma, but it's part of my job. That's one comma rule I go over. Placing commas after introductory words, phrases, or clauses, like in the example, this morning, comma, we will have a meeting. This morning is introductory, we is the subject, so you get a comma. I talk about the Oxford comma. The Oxford comma is the comma that goes right after the second to last item in the series. So in the first sentence, no Oxford comma is being used. I love my parents, comma, Fred and Rita. The second one, the Oxford comma is being used. I love my parents, comma, Fred, comma, and Rita. And I always stress the importance of the Oxford comma because it can change the meaning of the sentence. Like in this case, I love my parents, Fred and Rita. It makes it sound like the parents' names are Fred and Rita. In the second sentence, it makes it sound like Fred and Rita are two different people beyond your parents. So I guess it's more accurate to say whether you place an Oxford comma or not depends on what you mean. What do you mean in the sentence? And here's another one, right? A comma before or after an item, a person who's being addressed. It's time to eat, comma, mama, not it's time to eat mama, right? Those are two very different sentences. Mama does not want you eating her. It's time to eat, comma, mama. I also like to share inspiring stories with my students about writing. And one is about Jean-Dominique Bauby, pictured here. We watched the movie about him. Jean-Dominique Bauby on December 8, 1995, at the age of 43, he was a fashion magazine editor, a Frenchman, he was afflicted with locked-in syndrome, which left him completely paralyzed and unable to talk for the rest of his life. But his mind was perfectly intact. The horrible story. Can you imagine waking up from a coma? He went into a coma. He woke up 3 weeks later, discovered he couldn't move at all and couldn't talk, but his mind was fine. He lived about another 15 months, and he was pretty much that way for the rest of his life. It's awful, horrible. What did he do with his time? He wrote a book. The only thing he could move was he could blink his left eye. So the woman looking at him, that's Claude Mendebile. And what they would do is she would go through the French alphabet orally, starting with the letters that most commonly occurred, like A, B, or in English, we'd start with E, for instance. And when she got to a letter that he wanted, he would blink. And then she'd write the letter down. And then they'd start over. She'd go through the French alphabet orally. And when she got to the letter he wanted, he would blink. And she would write it down. It took an average of 2 minutes a word, several hours a day for 10 months. And eventually he had written this book, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. A beautiful, this would make great reading for class. A beautiful memoir written by Jean-Dominique Bauby about his experience with locked-in syndrome. So I share that story with students to inspire them. Here's a guy completely paralyzed, unable to talk, miserable. And yet he was able to blink out this book that has become a classic. He died 2 days after it was published. It also went on to become an Oscar-nominated film. So I like to share inspiring stories about writing to help the students feel motivated and inspired to work on their writing themselves. Here's a guy blinking out a book. You can do it too. You can write too. So again, your own best critic, celebrating your strengths, revising and editing, identifying your purpose, tailoring your tone to your audience, inspiring your audience, calling to action. Then I talk about their inner writing genius. And I define it that these are some books I wrote. And I define it as, so shameless self-promotion here. And I define the inner writing genius as your voice that makes you you, that makes you unique, that makes you stand out. I contend that everybody has this inner voice that can come out in our writing that is unique to us. When I say inner writing genius, I am not saying everybody is Shakespeare or Emily Dickinson or Toni Morrison. I'm simply saying we all have this unique inner voice. And in writing, you want to cultivate that so that that can come to the surface in your writing. That's what I've tried to do in my writing. That's what I encourage students to do in their writing. So I asked them, what's your personality? And how can your writing reflect your personality? Are you funny? Are you enthusiastic? Do you tend to pay compliments? Do you like chit chat? Some of this we covered before. Are you more formal or more casual? Do you have a particular hobby or passion that you could share with others? Like I shared Grow with you at the beginning. That's me trying to cultivate my inner writing genius on social media to try to make the world a better place. I want students to do that too. I have a word I made up about 30 years ago, poetification. And poetification means using words to build up others, to practice what I call transformative kindness. Poetification, using words to build up others, to practice what I call transformative kindness. I mentioned that on my Facebook page for Grow too. Transformative kindness isn't just being nice. It's Dalai Lama kindness, right? It's the kind of kindness that changes the world. And people can do that in their writing. You can cheer people on. You can guide people. You can be somebody who helps to clarify things. Everybody needs that. Somebody who can take something complicated and present it in a way that people will understand. That's a really important writing skill that a lot of people don't have, but some people may have that. Can you cultivate that? Helping people to be able to critique constructively. There's a difference between critiquing constructively and just ripping apart what somebody does. So helping people to use their words to cheer people on, use words to guide people, use words to clarify things, use words to treat constructively, and use words to promote fairness and equity, like I'm trying to do online with online messages that are more constructive and positive. Are you somebody who's good at showing empathy? You can do that in your writing. Are you somebody who's good at bringing people together? You can do that in your writing. Are you somebody who's good at staying calm? You can do that in your writing. Are you somebody who's good at helping people to see their strengths? Most of us are a little too good at seeing our weaknesses, so we don't need help there. Can we help people see their strengths? Those are all things we can do in our writing, right? Build empathy, cheer people on, bring people together, help them see their strength, be a non-anxious presence, a calm in the face of stress. I also stress to students the myth of the solitary genius. We have this popular romanticized notion of genius in our society. The geniuses work in isolation. It's the scientist in the laboratory, or the person scribbling away frantically in their office, or somebody working in their studio. It's usually frantic too, frantically working on something, as if geniuses always have to work frantically. And while geniuses might work in isolation, they almost always, I think they probably do always, have to collaborate sooner or later. That geniuses, and here I use the word genius, you can tell I like my little acrostics. Geniuses can gather to edit and nudge, inspiring uniqueness and success. In Genius, we are gathering, we're working together, we're not in isolation, to edit and nudge, inspiring uniqueness and success. In other words, cultivating our inner genius is a collaborative effort. One of the things we stress in our class, and Foundations of English stresses, is the importance of getting feedback from others. Other readers, we do peer editing in class. Students have to read each other's papers. I'll bet you do this too, those of you who teach writing, because cultivating that inner genius is a collaborative effort. I tell students, take any book you like and look at the acknowledgments section. You'll see that person has thanked a whole bunch of people who helped them make that book possible. So I want to dispel the myth of the solitary genius and stress instead that we work together. We're gathering to edit and nudge, inspiring uniqueness and success. So we talk about the importance of collaborating and giving feedback. I encourage students to get a critique partner. When you have somebody you're working with, ask them, what do they want? Ask them what they want. Like, what feedback do you want me to give you? I have 3 people I go to who give me feedback, and we ask each other, well, what do you want me to give you? Do you want me to correct your grammar? Or do you just want me to tell you if this plot line works or this character is convincing? What is it that you want? That helps with feedback. There's also the sandwich, which is starting positive, then you add the critique, then you end positive. That might seem sort of cheesy. It's a cheese sandwich, but it works and it's important. Starting with the positive, then what can you work on? And then ending with the positive, because most people focus on the negative. Addressing those higher order and lower order concerns, getting detailed and specific. And then, of course, critic as well. Celebrating, revising, identifying purpose, tailoring tone to audience, inspiring audience, and calling to action. And then there's some other grammar things I go over with students, like homophones that they often struggle with, and apostrophes like it's and its, your and your, there and there, going over those things with them. Whose and whose, to and to. And again, Foundations of English has a really good section on grammar that's very helpful there. I often talk also about the difference between EG and IE. We use those abbreviations a lot in higher ed, and people get them mixed up all the time. EG means, for example, IE means that is, or in other words. People often use them incorrectly. So, for example, I love going to exotic places, e.g. Venice, for example, Venice. Or I want to go to that Italian city with the canals, i.e. Venice. In other words, that Italian city with the canals, that's Venice. So in other words, Venice. I've been to Venice twice, by the way. It's fantastic. Sad that it seems to be sinking. And I talk about inclusive language. I'm very happy that Foundations of English talks about inclusive language on page 328. It has become increasingly acceptable. Now, some people will yell at me for this, but it's become increasingly acceptable to use they, them to refer to an individual. That's something we've been doing informally in our speech for years, and that's become increasingly acceptable. That's part of respecting that people have pronoun preferences. And I always stress to students the importance of respecting people's pronouns. Even if you don't understand their choices, you don't have to. You just need to respect it. We ask people what their names are, and we respect whatever people want to be called. We call them that. We need to do the same with pronouns too. Here's an example of they being used as for the singular, even though it's technically a plural. The student needs to select the courses they want for the spring. Now, grammatically, that's incorrect, right? Because student is singular, they is plural. But increasingly, that's become an acceptable practice. Again, I know some purists will call me out on this, but I've found over and over, this has become an increasingly acceptable thing to do. We also talk about wordiness. How do you reduce your words so you're not so verbose? So I like to show them, take out the word very anytime you can. You can replace it with something way more interesting. Or avoid the passive voice. The passive voice is when the subject is being acted on instead of acting. So in the first sentence, the book was written by Sue Monk Kidd. The book is the subject, but it's not doing the action. Sue Monk Kidd is. The second one, Sue Monk Kidd wrote the book. Sue Monk Kidd's the subject, and she's doing the action. So the second one is active voice. The first one is passive voice. Active voice is almost always, there are exceptions, but almost always preferable. It's shorter, it's tighter, it's clearer. There are times when you have to use passive voice, but I encourage students to avoid it as much as possible. And students also tend to use sort of qualifying phrases and clauses like I think, I feel, in my opinion, it seems to me, stuff like that. And I encourage students to take those out as much as possible because they make you sound like you're not confident. And also they add wordiness. I think we should move forward with the proposal. You could just say, we should move forward with the proposal. It's implied that this is what you think, and you sound more confident. I also encourage students not to just use fancy jargon just to use it, right? Sometimes they think they have to do that in college to sound more collegiate. And I say, you know, the clearer you can be, the better. Don't worry about fancy language unless you have to use it. I mean, there's a time and a place for jargon, but if you can avoid it, please do so. Instead of we should utilize this template to facilitate and expedite synergy, thereby increasing productivity, you could just say, this template will help us to work together better and faster to get more done. And then I talk about other unnecessary words, go over those as well. You can see more of those here. And then I like to end with more inspiration. I mentioned Malala Yousafzai. Malala Yousafzai has become quite well known. She was born in Pakistan in 1997. She's a Muslim girl. And she loved going to school, but then the Taliban moved into her area, Swat Valley, and prohibited girls from going to school. She continued to go anyway, along with some other girls, along with the guidance of her father. And at the age of 11, she started writing a blog under a pseudonym for the outside world to tell them about how the Taliban were treating her. So here's somebody using writing, a blog, to make a difference. Now, she paid dearly for that. On October 9th, 2012, a Talib got on her school bus and shot her in the face, trying to kill her. But she did survive, and in 2014, at the age of 17, she won the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts, promoting education for girls around the world. I share her with the students because she's another example of somebody using writing, a blog, to make a difference. I encourage students, again, to cultivate their inner writing genius, and that's a collaborative effort. It's a team effort. It's not something you do by yourself only. You might work in solitude, but then you got to collaborate. Cultivating our inner writing genius is about gathering to edit and nudge, inspiring uniqueness and success. I want to thank you for listening, and thank you for your time. I hope this was what you were looking for. I hope it was worthwhile. Thank you so much to Hawks for their wonderful resources, Foundations of English, and for this opportunity. Thank you to Sidra for their help today. I really appreciate everybody's assistance and guidance and support, and I welcome any questions or critiques that you have. Thank you so much. Let me stop sharing here and turn that off. There we go.
All right, while we wait for questions, do you have any closing remarks?
I don't think so, just that I'm really grateful. Thank you, Sidra, for your help. And I'm just really grateful for this opportunity. I hope people are doing well. And if you're in education like I am, good luck. We're in the thick of the semester right now. Looking forward to Thanksgiving break.
Absolutely. All right, let's give everyone a minute or so to populate their questions if they have any in the Q&A module. You can also drop them into the chat box, whichever is more comfy for you. All right. Well, if we don't have any questions, thank you, David, for all of that wonderful information, and thank you all for attending today. If you or any of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting for our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to the Learning and Growing website, which I'm going to go ahead and link in the chat right now for easy access. We will be emailing you a link of this recording once it becomes available, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sidra. I hope that was okay.
It was wonderful.
Oh, good, good. Is there anything else you need me to do?
Nope, I think that's it. It was a pleasure working with you. Thank you
Yeah, it
so
was great to
much.
meet you.
It was
Thank you
nice
so
to meet
much.
you as well.
Thank you. Made everything easy. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Take care.
Alrighty. Bye.